this video we'll explain the Poof variant on the OR out strategy. So the Poof variant on the OR out strategy says, use when your goal is a disjunction, and when you have a disjunction available whose disjuncts might imply your goal. Assume each disjunct of the original disjunction separately, and use it to try to derive one side of the disjunction, which is your goal. Then poof in the other side of the disjunction and complete the arrow in step. If you succeed with both arrow in steps, derive the disjunction, which is your goal, from the original disjunction and the two conditionals from the arrow in steps by wedge out. Let's see how this works in the context of a proof. So suppose we have the argument, if not A or B, then C. If A or F, then not A. E or B. Therefore, not A or C. So the first thing to notice is that we have a disjunction in our premises, and our goal is a disjunction. This is a sort of classic setup when you should be thinking, aha, I might want to use the Poof variant on the OR out strategy here. Okay, so we're going to start by placing our conclusion down at the bottom of the page. Now, we want to try to get this by wedge out. But in order to do that, we need two conditionals. We need one conditional that's E arrow not A or C. And then we also need one that's B arrow not A or C. So we don't have either of those conditionals, so we're going to need to create them. So we're going to do that using the rule of arrow in. So like arrow in proofs always start, we start by assuming the antecedent. So we're going to assume A here. And we want to try to get to the consequent. And we're also going to need a provisional assumption of B a little later down the road. And we're going to try to get from B to not A wedge C. Okay. So since we have provisional assumptions, we need an assumption dependence column. So lines 1 through 4 all depend on themselves because they're either assumptions or provisional assumptions. Okay, so we need to try to get from E to not A wedge C. Well, there's a not A in line 2 with the E, if E or F, then not A. So if we could get the antecedent there, we could get E wedge F, well then we could get not A by arrow out. Well, it's easy to get E wedge F. We can get that by 4 wedge in. So that will depend on what line 4 depends on, so it will depend on 4. So line 6 will be not A by 2, 5, arrow out. So that will depend on what lines 2 and 5 depend on. So that will depend on 2 and 4. And then, once we have not A, we can poof in the C by 6, wedge in. And then we can complete our arrow in step. That's going to be lines 4 through 7, arrow in. So that's going to depend on what line 7 depends on, except for 4. So it'll depend on 2. So that's halfway there. Then we assume B on line 9. So that will depend on 9, because provisional assumptions depend on themselves. And then now we again want to get to not A, wedge C. But here we see that we have a, if not A, wedge, then, or B, then C. So what we see is that B is actually going to lead us to the other side of the disjunction. So we need to do a not A, wedge B. That's going to depend on 9. That's line 10. And that's by 9, wedge in. So you see how the wedge in is acting as a kind of a bridge. Okay, and then line 11, we'll get C. By 1, 10, arrow out. So that's going to depend on what 1 and 10 depend on. So it'll depend on 1 and 9. And then we can poof in the not A this time. So that will also depend on 1 and 9. And that's by 11, wedge in. And then we can get B, arrow, not A or C from 9 through 12, arrow in. So that'll depend on whatever line 12 depends on, except for 9. So it'll depend on 1. And then, once we've done all, so you see how one side of our starting disjunction, E wedge B, so the E, led us to not A, led us to one side of our goal disjunction. And the other side of our starting disjunction, so B here, led us to the other side of the goal disjunction. So it led us to C. So that's going to be, that's the setup for when you're using the poof variant on the or out strategy. That's how it's going to look. Okay, so this line here, the wedge out, it's going to be justified by lines 3 and 8 and 13, wedge out. So that will depend on what 3 and 8 and 13 depend on. So 3 depends on itself, 8 depends on 2, and 13 depends on 1. So this line 14 will depend on 1, 2, and 3. And that's how you do a proof using the poof variant strategy on or out.